So our final speaker is Dr. Tikhon Alexander Pino. Dr. Pino is the Assistant Director of the Papist Patristic Institute at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. Dr. Pino has just recently published a book entitled Essence and Energies, Being and Naming God in St Gregory Palamas, which comprehensively explores the essence-energy question throughout Palamas's writings. He is currently involved in editing a volume on the topic of hesychast theology in connection with the Romanian Church's Year of Hesychasm. And he is also organizing a symposium on St. John of Damascus with the Papist Patristic Institute. So Dr. Pino's presentation today is entitled The Logoi, the Divine Energies, and the Processions of Providence in St. Gregory Palamas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tikhon Alexander Pino.
Oh, you're muted right now, Dr. Pino, sorry.
I thought I would run through it one time muted, and then I would give it a go. If I must, I'll do my first run. Audible. Am I audible now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Carson, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here with you today. Thank you to Sam and everyone in the Dionysius Circle for your gracious invitation and for organizing this panel of talks. I need to apologize right up front because I've been very sick this week, and while I think I might finally be starting to recover a little, I'm afraid I'm still a little bit under the weather, so that might reflect on my performance today. So I ask your forbearance. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today stems from a small section in the first chapter of my book, looking at the question of essence and energies in St. Gregory Palamas. So if you're a millionaire or independently wealthy, it's now officially out and for sale. If you want to go to the cheaper route and find the illegal leaked version that's out on the internet, that's a perfectly fair punishment for all the illegal PDFs I've acquired over the years. So I won't hold it against you. So the section in that book does deal with the term processions and whether this is a term that is a generic synonym in Palamas for energies, and whether these two terms are interchangeable for Palamas. So one of the things I wanted to understand when I set out on my doctoral research back in 2017 was what exactly the divine energies are in St. Gregory Palamas. So there's no shortage of discussion about whether the essence of God and his energies differ according to a real distinction, a conceptual distinction, a distinction cum fundamento in re, and indeed there's no shortage of discussion about whether the essence energies distinction is coherent, whether it's traditional, whether it violates divine simplicity. Yet what I found was that there is very, very little discussion about what these divine energies actually are. What does this basic word mean, and what does it cover? More importantly, there seemed to be little interest in the secondary scholarship, to say nothing of more amateur discussions, of mining the many, many writings of St. Gregory Palamas to see what he actually says about any of this. Because it's not like he didn't leave us with a wealth of written material. Yet the first thing you notice when you start reading and talking to people about St. Gregory Palamas and his theology is that everyone has a theory and everyone thinks they know what Palamas says, though without actually reading Palamas, or at least not reading too much of Palamas. So particularly in English, where most of the discussion has tended to happen, we know that the primary sources are few. Though St. Gregory Palamas wrote more than 25 treatises and letters on the essence energies distinction, with his biggest work, the Antiretics against the Kindinos, filling more than 700 pages in the printed edition, people are still content to rely on just a handful of translated texts, often fighting vehemently about their interpretations of Palamas without going any further into the sources, if they go into the sources at all. So it always seems to come down to what St. Gregory must have meant if he were to make any sense at all, or if he were to align with what we understand in our theology more broadly. So if you ask the basic question, what exactly are energies? You get lots of replies, but very few answers. So the approach to the question, what is X, takes at least two different forms. If you ask, for example, what is a vegetable? I can answer in at least two basic ways. I can take you to the produce section in the supermarket and point out different vegetables. Right? This would give you a concrete example and instances that indicate what this word vegetable actually refers to. And if you had never heard that word before, and then showing you what a vegetable is would be the most immediate way of enlightening you. So a squash is a vegetable, lettuce is a vegetable, asparagus is a vegetable. These are obviously not definitions, but if you did not know what the word referred to, this would be the primary way of showing you. And if you were going to try to distinguish, say, vegetables from fruits, we would at least now have a set of concrete realities that we were referring to. So we're not just throwing around technical terms and jargon with a vague sense of what they actually mean. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in my study of energeia in St. Gregory Palamas was to look closely at what specific things he calls energies. And this list to me was illuminating. It includes not only God's goodness, his wisdom, life, being, creativity, judgment, mercy, and other things like this, but also God's simplicity, his incorporeality, his eternity, immutability, and other terms of negation, alongside seeming abstractions and other attributes that perhaps seem less dynamic, or let's say energetic. Now, there's a lot we could say about what that long list, and that's only a part of it, what that long list of concrete energies would tell us about what an energy actually is. But let's look today at the question of identifying energies from a different angle, not from the list of specific energeia, but from the language for talking about energies itself. Because the second way of approaching the question, what is X, what is an energeia in this case, is to ask, by what other names is this category known or described? In this case, or in the case of St. Gregory Palamas, are there other terms that he uses synonymously with energeia, or does the term correspond to other, perhaps more familiar metaphysical terms? Because again, we often think we know what energies are. Mainly, we think of them as some kind of radiation of the divine essence, a kind of electrical current going forth from God and doing some kind of very dynamic work, whether this be the sanctification of the cosmos or the simple filling of all things with divine presence, or even the very infusion of all things with being and life by an outpouring of creative power. But again, what does Palamas himself say about this term? And I make the novel suggestion that we should take the time to read what he says and allow him to give us his own descriptions. So if you're familiar with the scholarship on St. Gregory Palamas to date, you will doubtless have heard that energies in Palamas are basically a cipher for processions in Dionysius. So in 1936, Basil Krivoshein spoke of the divine energies as the exteriorization and manifestation of God, or his procession and coming forward, for which the term is πρόοδος. We find the exact same language in Logoi, who speaks of the divine energies as God outside the essence. Cyprian Kern, writing after Logoi, says that the energies are that in the absolute and imparticipable divinity, which is oriented towards the world, which reveals itself and makes itself accessible to it. They are, above all, the Dionysian distinctions, processions, communications, and participations, that whereby God is turned towards the world. Clément Lialine, writing in 1946, will say that the energies are processions by means of which the super essence of God reveals itself. They are God as he is turned toward creation, even to the point that energy is the, quote, passing of the divine ideas from power to act, which is, of course, creation. This emphasis on the processional, revelatory, and even creative role of the divine energies, it must be noted, is a distinct feature of what we would call the Neopalamite movement, which, among other things, sought to retrieve the theology of St. Gregory Palamas from the neo-scholastic criticism of Roman Catholic authors like Petavius, Alatius, and more recently, Martin Jugy. One of the things we see, therefore, when we look at the interpretation of the essence energies distinction in this period starting before the Second World War is that these new Orthodox scholars very explicitly and adamantly reject what we might call the traditional interpretation of the divine energies, which treated them as synonymous with the divine names, and thus with what Logoi called the sterile concept attributes of scholasticism. Thus, in seeking to distance Palamas and Orthodox theology as a whole from scholastic categories and questions, these 20th century Neopalamites make a very conscious shift towards a more dynamic, revelatory conception of the divine energies, recasting them, as Father Dimitri Staniloae would put it, as attributes of God in motion. These energies are no longer the stuff of abstract speculation, but as Logoi calls them, living forces of the living God. And it is within this context that we see a new emphasis on energeia as procession and the manifestation of God in or into the world. All of this, by the way, goes back to Father Sergius Bulgakov and his own peculiar reading of Palamas, which had identified the concept of sofia energy with the revelation and manifestation of God, or God for the world, contrasted with his incomprehensible and transcendent essence, or God in himself. And of course, this is a paradigm with which we're very familiar, this dichotomy between God in himself, God for the world, which gets mapped onto the essence energies distinction. And if you're interested in that subject, Dmitry Biryukov has a forthcoming article that gives a great overview of Bulgakov's position and how his theology gave rise to an important response from Florovsky, all in the 1920s and 1930s. So this is the status questionis that we inherit from Neopalamite scholarship, which largely determines the modern interpretation of the essence energies distinction. In the modern period, of course, where the figure of St Maximos the Confessor has risen to special prominence, we also have the added layer and the added complicating factor of people wanting to integrate the doctrine of the Logoi into the doctrine of the divine energies. And so we now see the divine energies identified not only with Dionysian procession, but with the Logoi of St. Maximus. And thus, for somebody like Father Nicholas Ludovicos, there's a kind of lowest common denominator, which I think is fairly representative, in which the divine energies of Palamas are equivalent to the divine names in St. Basil, the processions and participations of Dionysius, the Logoi of St. Maximus, and the things around God of the Cappadocians. So in other words, everybody has their own special term for this same concept, and everything gets sort of steamrolled. What is more, precisely as the divine processions or Logoi, these are the, quote, expressions of the divine loving will, and are thus inherently relational and participational, as Father Nicholas Ludovicos says. And this, I think, is where we are with some people rightfully scratching their heads, asking if the divine energies are the pre-eternal Logoi of beings, how does that square with the activity of God in history, or with the revelation of God, let's say, to the saints as uncreated light? And what does any of it have to do with the light of Tabor or the vision of the hesychasts? How do all these doctrines fit together? So I'll tell you what I found in my own study of St. Gregory Palamas, and offer what I hope might be a path forward for understanding these different theories and concepts. And I should repeat here that I'm not offering an exegesis of Dionysius or even Maximus, but of Palamas. So it's within his writings and his usage that I'm parsing the language of energeia, πρόοδος, and Logoi, although obviously the connections will come. So the first thing that we see, or the first thing that one discovers when one goes meticulously through the writings of Palamas, cataloging his language and trying to find as many glosses for energeia as one can, is that the language of processions, πρόοδοι, or God's manifestations ad extra, is conspicuously absent. So Palamas offers many glosses and synonyms for things that he calls energies, generally. These are God's attributes, or idiomata. These are the things around God, meaning the things around the divine nature, because the energies are those things that characterize and belong to God's nature or essence. They're his essential attributes. These are the things that mark the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in common. Again, as attributes not of individual persons, but of the nature or the essence. In this sense, they are all that the Father has, which is the scriptural phrase that the Lord uses to describe his possession of all of the essential attributes of God, all that the Father has, which the Son has by nature as the consubstantial offspring of the Father. This is why we refer to them as the things said of God, or the divine predicates or the divine names shared by the Trinity, and being called the things of nature, or simply that which is essential to God. By far, their most common designation after energeia is simply dynamis, or power, since what the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit share are equal and identical powers. Each power is one in the Holy Trinity. So we speak of one will, one mercy, one judgment in God, although he's three in persons. Yet again, among such terms, idiomata, dynamis, ta usiodi, pardon the Greek jargon, ta physika, ta peritheon, etc. What we do not find is that Palamas speaks of the divine energies, powers, or attributes of the Trinity as the Trinity's processions, not generally. Certainly, they are not spoken of generically as God's self-revelation, his advances to creatures and theophanies in the world, but neither does he apply the term πρόοδος specifically to God's energies as a whole. So where does this idea come from? Where do we see the origins of a misunderstanding regarding the relationship of πρόοδη and energeia? Leaving aside any influence exercised by the Dionysian corpus, where we do find the word energeia used as a synonym for procession, the culprit, as far as Palamas is concerned, is extremely easy to find. It really all boils down to a work which everyone here will know, the 150 chapters. The 150 chapters of St. Gregory Palamas, which we have long been told is among the most important writings of Palamas, is not only the one complete work of Palamas that has been available in English, it's also the text that was the only text of Palamas that was available to scholars in means Patrologia Graeca for centuries. So Logoi, for example, would not have had access to a critical edition of St. Gregory Palamas. He probably would not have had access to the manuscripts, and therefore he would have relied on means Patrologia Graeca, which is limited to the Theophanes dialogue, and of course the 150 chapters, which Martin Jogy tells us is a summa of Palamas's theology. And as we all know, once you have a summa, you look no further in anybody's corpus. Where would you? So this gave the work, and it continues to give the work, a completely lopsided authority as a representative text of St. Gregory Palamas. And we should say here that the 150 chapters is unique because it is a patchwork of excerpts from Gregory's writings. Most of the time it is taking things out of their original context. So for example, all of the passages that are cited from the enteretics against the Kintinos have been completely stripped out of their original discussion. So you have long discussions where St. Gregory Palamas is exegeting Gregory the theologian and explaining passages that Gregory Akindinos has misinterpreted. And then a small excerpt out of this broader discussion will get excerpted in the 150 chapters. And the work which the 150 chapters excerpts most heavily from is a treatise called On Union and Distinction. And this is a treatise that gives an exegesis of Dionysius. And it's because Dionysius is complicated, this treatise is one of the most complicated treatises in the whole corpus of St. Gregory Palamas. And it's dealing with the phenomenon of unity and distinction, and the way that unity and distinction is present in all of God's attributes, sort of all the way up and all the way down. And it functions within the corpus as a kind of propedeutic for understanding the essence energies distinction. But because On Union and Distinction gets excerpted so heavily in the 150 chapters, it really colors that work, even though it's only a small work in the grand scheme of Gregory's writings. So in chapter 71 of the 150 chapters, Palamas explicitly identifies the energies of the spirit as processions and manifestations of the one God. Whereas God, he says, whatever he is according to essence, is beyond all vision, participation, knowledge, and manifestation. At the level of his processions, manifestations, powers, and energies he has participated in, known, and named. Such processions, by the way, include familiar energies such as being, toon, the good, life, and wisdom, identified in the divine names as good processions of the one God. And as I said, much of this stems from the treatise on union and distinction, which is dealing with the self-purification and diversification of goodness, of God's goodness. Yet is this evidence of a generic equivalence between energeia and πρόοδος? If we look at Gregory's wider corpus, it's not. It's clear that this is coming from a specific context. And what we find in the case of procession and manifestation, when we look at it in its original setting, is actually the variegated language of causality on the one hand, and divine self-diffusion on the other hand, associated specifically with divine providence, πρόνοια. So my main argument here, my main finding, is that when we do talk about procession in St. Gregory Palamas, he's almost always dealing with πρόνοια. He's almost always dealing with the mechanics of divine providence, the self-diffusion of providence. And again, in the exegesis of Dionysius. So unsurprisingly, the topic of divine providence and the language associated with it arise most frequently in Gregory's engagement of Dionysius. In his exegesis of Divine Names 5.2, Palamas notes that in referring to the good, being, life, and wisdom as processions, Dionysius is dealing specifically with the manifold providence that is productive of the good, productive of being, and productive of life and wisdom. And this is demonstrated when Palamas attempts to set the passage in its original context, drawing attention to the sense in which the aforementioned participables are ultimately one. So again, because they're both one and many. And if I can, I will share my screen just to give you this one. I have two short quotations. So he hymns the beneficent manifest providence, transcendent goodness and cause of all things, as well as being, life, and wisdom, the essence-making, wise-making, and life-giving cause of things that partake of essence, life, and intellect, distinguishing in this way the divine and uncreated energies, namely divine providence, and the things that belong to it from the divine superessentiality. And having said that the former are the manifested, named, and participated processions of God, the great one, Dionysius, then adds, the good is not one thing, being another, life another, and wisdom another, thereby speaking of the things that are participated in and named, and to put it simply, the manifest providence of God and what belongs to it. This comprehensive, if dense, definition of divine providence identifies a number of specific divine energies as processions, namely being, life, wisdom, and their productive modalities. Yet it subordinates all of them to the broad category of πρόνοια. The description of the divine procession as productive of essence, ousiopios, is particularly prominent in the Theophanes. Theophanes, by the way, another work that is excerpted in the 150 chapters. Here it is the procession into beings of Divine Names 5.1, again connected to life and wisdom. In his treatise against Grigoras, his latest opponent, Palamas glosses this term with the synonymous phrase creative processions, δημιουργικές πρόοδοι, from Divine Names 5.8. Here again, the term is equivalent to divine providence. And Palamas further identifies this with divine intellections noesis, foreordinations, proorismi, and goodnesses, agathotites. So Palamas's treatment of πρόνοια or providence across his writings is so extensive that it almost dwarfs his discussion of theosis and deification, where obviously most of the attention in scholarship has been paid. Of all the specific divine energies, providence is by far the most frequently utilized in Gregory's polemics to establish the distinction between energy and essence. And the reason for that is because the divine will is free, and the divine nature obviously would be distinguished from those free movements of the will. This is undoubtedly due to the prominent position of the providential processions in the Dionysian corpus, as far as his source material goes. Indeed, Gregory will dedicate an entire work to the exegesis of this Dionysian theme in order to establish that in God there is both one and many. And again, that's the treatise on union and distinction. And because this treatise on union and distinction is in turn absorbed into the chapters, scholars making use of this treatise without substantive exploration of Gregory's other writings have sometimes come away with the notion that energies as a whole are reducible to God's creative processions, and that the essence energies distinction in general is reducible to the problem of the one and the many. And this is especially the case, if I'm not mistaken, with Eric Pearl, who interprets the category of energy in toto as its self-diffusion of the one into many in proportion to created realities. Again, on the basis of the 150 chapters. Yet the indivisible division of providence is not the same as the distinction between the one essence of God and its manifold energies. Indeed, Palamas never speaks of a diffusion of the divine ousia into multiplicity. In terms of God's manifold providence, πρόνοια, the problem of unity and multiplicity is indeed synonymous with procession, being concerned with the fact of divine self-diffusion. And again, I'll share my screen here to give you the second quote. God is said to be multiplied in his volition, volimati, for the production of each being made manifold in his providential processions, but he remains indivisibly one, as the sun in sending forth many rays remains in unity. Yet while Gregory will make ample use of the providential dynamic to argue that God's energies cannot therefore be identified with his ineffable and non-proceeding, simple and unified essence, he does not equate the category of energy as a whole with providence and its participations. In the end, providence, like deification, is but one of many divine energies forming a specific subset of what is known around God from eternity. Nevertheless, it ought to be pointed out that it is precisely the operation of divine providence, specifically centering on the productivity of the divine intellect and will, that allows us to speak of an energy of God ad extra. This is because divine intellection, as the causal procession of God, constitutes an overflow, an hypervoli, of goodness into beings. Though the essence of God as what God is remains ineffable, the creative energy of divine providence, as God's going forth towards creatures, provides a way of naming God properly. To this end, Gregory will make use of the Dionysian conception of an ecstatic power, whereby God goes outside himself, exo eαυτού γίνεται. Palamas identifies this power explicitly with divine providence. For the divine providence, he says, is nothing other than God's turning, epistrophy, and goodwill towards what is lower. At this level, God is the cause of all things, since providence is productive of the things outside of God. Yet it is to be especially noted that as a dynamis, as a power, providence also remains a natural and essential faculty of God, neither coming into being nor changing in relation to creatures. As the volition, voulisis of God for beings, the providential processions are not to be identified with the creatures themselves, nor does God's providential activity begin with the act of creation, understood as the temporal beginning of creatures. Providence, rather, is a knowledge, this is a quotation, a knowledge befitting God, end quote, and divine self-contemplation. The Greek is αυτοπτική theoria, so literally self-seeing contemplation, αυτοπτική theoria, in which God has no other object than himself, η εαυτού theoria. So he's, in other words, in describing this sort of motion towards creatures, this is not the actual creation of beings, but the self-diffusion of the divine mind. But again, in self-contemplation. For this reason, it is found among the divine attributes, namely providence is found among the divine attributes. Ta physikos prosonda, and like the other divine energies, is contemplated essentially around God. Even providence, then, to say nothing of the other divine energies, is therefore not outside God in this sense, however much it is oriented towards what is not God. It is rather emphytos, or built in to the divine nature. Thus, even if the reality of the divine processions allows us to speak of a movement of God ad extra, this language is qualified by the recognition that divine providence and all that belongs to it remains an essential feature of the divine nature, even while it is precisely this πρόνοια, or providence, which is ultimately productive of creatures outside of God himself. And so the point there is to say that providence is precisely the specific place where you can talk about this movement of God ad extra, where you can talk about God's manifestation or movement towards creatures, which is productive of creatures. But again, this is not a way of talking about the divine energy specifically. This is, or rather generically, this is specifically reserved for the mechanics of divine providence, πρόνοια, which is ultimately the mechanics of the divine mind. So I will leave it there, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, not least of which will involve litigating the essence energies distinction over and over again. So hopefully we have time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Pino. Okay, so we have some time for questions. Remember to turn on your video if you'd like to ask a question, and use the hand raise function, please. All right, we have one question, Nathaniel.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask whether would you say that with respect to Gregory Palamas and his reception, and then later Byzantium, would you say that there are any developments or trends in reading his theological writings with folks like Mark of Ephesus or Gennadius Scholarius?
There's definitely when you get to Scholarius, there's an effort to translate him into terms that would be adequate for the highly developed Latin logical discipline that had unfolded, in the time since. I mean, probably even at the time that Gregory is writing, he was not benefiting from a lot of these fine-tuned distinctions and categories that existed in the West, and maybe that's for better or for worse. But certainly Scholarius is somebody who's trying to have a meeting of the worlds there. With St. Mark, it's not as clear to me. I haven't seen that specifically. He seems to be a little more conservative in terms of presenting the essence energies distinction, but that's probably an open question.
Okay, we have Eonat.
I wanted to ask if these logoi are the principle of difference created by the logos and implanted in creation. What is the composition of the energies which are sent to the creation? Are these energies as differentiated, or are they simple because they come from the simplicity of God?
So if we're talking about the working of providence as an energeia, then St. Gregory Palamas would say that it has both unity and multiplicity at every stage, so that even as even if you were to sort of chart the self-diffusion of the divine mind, which accounts for all the differences, that you still also have unity within each level, and that there's still more diversification within that. So at least that's the way he presents it. It's hard to wrap one's mind around, but certainly the principle of analogia, where you have this unity and distinction that are simultaneous, is a very distinct part of the energeia of providence.
All right, Vincent.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting presentation. You touched on something that I've been thinking about a lot, the αυτοπτική θεωρία, and I was curious about what you think Palamas even means by this, in the sense that, I mean, when I read that phrase, my mind immediately goes, of course, to, Aristotle, like God as self-thinking thought, like God's contemplating himself. Or maybe I imagine a lot of Orthodox theologians who would want to put a Trinitarian spin on it and talk about the different persons in this kind of mutual contemplation, perichoresis. I guess it would be connected to what you referenced as the theos noesis, the divine intellections. And maybe that is actually a Dionysian doctrine I need to look more into. But could you speak to those sources? What could he possibly mean by αυτοπτική θεωρία?
Yeah, so he's when you're dealing with Palamas's sources in this context, it's you have Dionysius, you have some Maximus in the background, although he's not a primary reader of the Ambigua, for example. So he's not dealing with Maximus primarily through there. He's reading Maximus more often as a commentator on Dionysius. So when he's reading the Scholia, he's going to refer to their author as St. Maximus the Confessor. So when you're dealing with Palamas' sources, it's basically that nexus of Jonas Scythopoulos, Maximus, and Dionysius. So he's very much, as a 14th century late Byzantine author, he's dealing with the commentary tradition more than any kind of raw Dionysius, the way that a modern reader would be. But yeah, certainly Aristotle is in the background. I mean, to me, the most interesting thing is the way that this actually correlates to scholastic theories of creation, which actually are often put forward as being in tension with Palamas, but are completely unaware that this is for Palamas a basic Christian understanding of the plurality of the divine mind. It's not that God is actually looking at objects that are other than himself and then creating them, right? But the logoi according to which he creates are just himself.
Well, this is, if I can add, since you mentioned Father Ludovicos, I don't remember exactly where he writes it, but like I've been to his lessons before even, and he'll talk about the Western understanding of God often being almost like the eternal bachelor, in the sense that like and this might be something of caricature, but it's like the idea that the scholastic God, in particular the Thomistic God, he only looks at himself, and so it takes almost on like a psychoanalytic notion that it's narcissistic. God doesn't ever know anything outside of himself because there's no, according to Ludovicos in scholasticism and exo eaftou yinete, God never actually goes out of himself because he's just looking at himself, and that's how he produces the world, and that's how he brings the world back to himself. And so I'm curious, when we talk about the αυτοπτική θεωρία, the self-contemplation of God, like, well, first, I guess there's the question of, is Ludovicos characterizing Latin scholasticism correctly? That's probably doubtful. The second is then like, are we subject to the same kind of issue of like, is God really going out of himself? I mean, would that question what it means to be divine, I guess? If you're going to be absolute, do you have to be self-centered? I don't know. I don't want to get too off the Palamite path, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from here.
Yeah, I'm gonna punt on that because it's trying to reconcile. He's trying to reconcile or tangle with narratives that are much bigger than anything so I don't want to get into sweeping generalizations about the scholastic mode versus the orthodox. Yeah, that's yeah. So I'm just gonna punt it.
All right, fair enough. Thank you.
All right, we have Jonathan.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Pino. Thank you for a great talk. That was very fun to listen to. I'm going to ask a rather much more mundane question, and perhaps it was already answered and it just went over my head. But I'm curious what the relationship is between like St. Maximus and his disputation with Pyrrhus, referring to how there are two essences and then two wills, and then that the number of energies in God are equal to the number of essences, how that usage of energy relates to how you were describing Palamas using the word energy in a more multiplicity effect type of way, if I'm understanding you properly.
Yeah, so the idea that there's one energy per nature is an important Christological argument, and it goes to what Palamas would call the periektiki energeia, the natural energy, the energy that characterizes the nature. So this is when you as a human being act in a way that is distinctly human, as opposed to the sun shining and doing something that is distinctly solar, that has nothing to do with human activity. And of course, the juxtaposition is between created and uncreated activity. So St. Gregory it's very clear that there is a periektiki energeia. There's an activity that encompasses all activity, but there is still a difference. So fire, for example, has one activity. It's doing what fire does. But nevertheless, when fire burns the piece of paper that I bring close to it, and when it lights up the room, it's also doing. Those are also two different energies, right? One is the ability to burn paper, and one is the ability to light up the room, and we can distinguish between those without saying that in either case fire is doing anything other than being itself. So I think that's in the Christological context, that's what you're dealing with. So.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Pino, do you have time for a few more questions, or you want to maybe close it here?
Yes, although I should say I don't know. I can't apologize for how expensive the book is. So if that's your question, we can say
the Kindle is not that expensive, actually. It's
not, and the illegal PDF is even cheaper.
Yeah, right.
Well, I have a question. I know you mentioned Eric Pearl. In his dissertation and elsewhere, he seems to present Neoplatonism as leading to a problem, or Neoplatonic participation leads to some kind of dilemma. And I think Professor Hiker kind of mentioned some of the dilemmas involved in Plato. And the idea is that the essence energies distinction, in the way that Pearl formulates it, and perhaps in terms of this idea of theophany, is supposed to solve a problem, like solve a philosophical problem that's present in the pagan Neoplatonists, so that the essence energy doctrine has a kind of philosophical value once you realize problems endemic to the Neoplatonic system, and you're kind of forced to seek for an answer. I was wondering if you think Palamas and the essence energies distinction can do that kind of work, where you can kind of look at the Neoplatonic system and look at how the one relates to the many within that closed system, point out a problem endemic to it that only accepting the essence energies distinction will solve. Is that possible?
So the only thing I'm wondering is how much of that narrative is dependent on seeing the essence energies distinction as essentially about the one and the many, And like I said, I don't think that's ultimately what it's about. And I think it ends up conflating something that's a feature of one energeia, which is the energeia of providence, with the essence energies structure as a whole. Because the essence energies distinction is about preserving the transcendence of God in the face of all these things that we have to, as Christians, have to recognize, right? The participation, first of all, created participation in God, right? In which all beings participate, but also the fact of deification, and we have to somehow distinguish between what it means to become God by nature and what it means to become God by adoption or by grace. So to the extent that that's what the essence energies distinction is really for, I'm not sure to what extent it would help. I mean, obviously, I don't know how a Christian could say that it doesn't ultimately, insofar as it's the correct conception of reality. I don't know how you could say it doesn't sort of solve problems in that way, but so yeah, I'm not sure how much it depends on focusing it on the problem of multiplication. Yeah, the multiplicity, created multiplicity coming from an ultimate unity.
Okay. So I'm wondering if that's kind of the wrong question to ask, maybe. Is there an agreement with the Neoplatonic system then? And if there's not an agreement, is it possible to show why an Orthodox theological standpoint is superior to the Neoplatonic framework? Or is it just going to be two systems that are just can't dialogue with one another? You couldn't show how Platonism has to break down and why you're forced to kind of philosophically accept the Orthodox theological view. Or is it just like, well, we believe as Christians, what we believe, and we have the essence energy doctrine as a way to explain it. And then there's kind of Platonism over here, but there isn't really a way to show how one requires the Platonist system necessarily has to break down, and you have to accept the Christian framework.
So I'll be modest and say what is I think the truth, that my work was intended to look at what Palamas says, and that now that we've got that straight, maybe we can compare that to Neoplatonism. But I think I would be going out on a limb if I tried to really pin down what the Neoplatonic view was and how it differed from the essence energies distinction. I mean, some of the things that jump out are right. What the energies of God are. I mean, Palamas is clear that they are not substantial, and that they simply inhere in the essence. Nevertheless, they're not accidents. They're not essential differences. These are all features that would seem relevant to like a comparison with Neoplatonism, and obviously a lot of the critiques that he had to field from his opponents were criticisms that were trying to paint him as a Neoplatonist or as a Platonist. Of course, he was able to fire back and say, if you don't make the divine energies attributes of God, inessential attributes of God, or essential attributes but that are non-substantial, then you end up making these participables into Platonic ideas, which just sort of subsist on their own. So obviously for Palamas, he would, for him, insofar as Plato means a sort of doctrine of pre-existent forms somewhere between God and creatures, that's obviously out, right? But that's just paganism too. So,
okay, do we have one more question? I think Professor Vasilakis had a question.
Yes, may I?
Absolutely, yeah.
So thank you very much. That was excellent. So just two clarifications, or perhaps two corollaries. So actually, the Orthodox theologians in the 20th century, for example, Christos Gianaras, would say that employing the Palamite theology or in Orthodox Christianity, we can know God as a person through the energies. So as I have understood you, you say actually that Gianaras and also many other theologians like Logoi have meant a subset of these uncreated energies, actually the pronoia, the providence of God. And then you also say that actually, according to Palamas, perhaps what he ascribes to God, Palamas would expect that also Western theology would ascribe to Palamas. But then I'm just wondering, with respect to the prodi, the πρόοδος in Dionysius, could then still have the problem whether the πρόοδος, according to a Western interpretation, is created and in an Orthodox interpretation, uncreated. So apart from this kind of productive dialogue, could there still be kind of conflict in order for more clarification? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. I think it's the first time I've ever spoken to you in person, so it's nice to meet you. Yeah, I mean, the basic disagreement is not how, I think the classic disagreement, now it's become, it's become qualified by the fact that many Westerners feel free to abandon the sort of old, what used to be thought of as the Catholic position. So it's obviously very, it's up for grabs now. But the basic disagreement between, let's say, Akindinos and Palamas was whether these methekta, the being, the life, the wisdom that creatures participate in are created or uncreated. That's the whole, in a way, the whole discussion. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about only about these methekta, only about these processions, or we're talking about other divine energies, because at the end of the day, if one person thinks they're created and one person thinks they're uncreated, well, it doesn't matter how big that file is. The debate is over whether it's the status of the file. So, yeah, my discussion doesn't depend on that particular disagreement, but I think, yeah, it was to expand the concept of energeia. But yeah, I don't know if yeah, to the extent that a Westerner would still uphold the idea that these participables, these processions are created, then obviously that's in conflict with what Palamas is trying to teach. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for a great talk. And I'll hand it over to Sam now to close things up.
Yeah, yeah, thank you again, Dr. Pino, especially, doing it even though you're feeling under the weather. So I really appreciate that and hope you get better soon. And yeah, I'd just like to say to everyone, thanks so much for coming. It's been a great day. Thank you especially to all the scholars who, wrote fantastic papers, and everyone who, of course, contributed to the discussion. Big thanks to all of you as well. And yeah, it's been a great day, and I hope everyone, found it edifying. And yeah, and so we'll have more events in the future. So please, check out the website if you have a chance. And yeah, so thanks everyone, and have a great day. Thanks for coming. Thank you for contributing. Yeah. Take care.